Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon DNA. Welcome back. So in today's episode, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon DNA and the early medieval DNA research that's happened in recent years. Now, the really important thing to start off with is a lot of this research begins from the point of view of two writers from the early medieval period or the late Roman period, depending on how you take it. You've got Gildas. Now, Gildas is a Welsh writer. He is a priest, and he is coming from a very apocalyptic background. He's taking inspiration from the Old Testament of the Bible, and he is putting his world that he sees it through this, and he's very, very dismissive and very, very angry with a lot of the late Roman and possibly early medieval Welsh princes and people who are interacting in Wales. They're not very good, they're not very Christian, and he's calling them out on their bad behaviour. And he's got some lines where he talks about how these people, the Romans have brought in the Saxons to fight for them, and how the Saxons have turned on them. And we don't know if Gildas's writings are very, very regional, and he's talking about a small area, or if he's talking about the whole country. He does mention some really intriguing stuff, like that sort of suggests towards a contract between the Romano-British or the Roman authorities and the Saxons who are coming in and fighting for them, but it's very, very difficult to actually bring out what he's actually trying to say. And there's also some really interesting stuff like, oh, the Britons went back up into the hills and stuff like that, which I hope to bring out more in future episodes. Following on from that, we've got the Venerable Bede. Now, Bede's writing a lot later than the events of the Aventus, of this migration of people into the British Isles at the end of the Roman period. And so because of that, it might be a lot more mythological. He's relying on older historical sources, and he's also taking a story, and he's developing a story of how the Anglo-Saxons became Christian, how God chose the Anglo-Saxons, specifically of Northumbria in this case, to actually bring the message of Christianity into the British Isles. So that's the two sources that we start off with, and they become the foundations of most genetic research as well, because people go, well, this is the historical sources, this is what we're trying to find in the DNA. And that can give us an unfair bias, or also difficulties when we're really trying to understand what's going on, and I'll talk about that later in the episode. Now, with this as well, we have got some other things as well. Some of you who've been around the channel a while may have seen a video I did called Did the Anglo-Saxons Exist? That video exploded in many ways and caused a lot of vitriolic and unpleasant comments in the sections. Of course the English existed! Ah, wokeism! Frickin' nuts. Read the comments section. Have a look at it. It's emotional. But anyway, moving past that and my little emotional outburst there, I was doing a book review on Susan Osteisen's work, and basically the idea was to look at it, to take her idea, and what I think is really useful, as I've said before, is that we are using Gildas and Bede as the basis of a lot of this research. What if Gildas and Bede are wrong? What if something is going on that we just don't have all the information of, and so because of that, that's skewing our data results? It's like if you did science. If you start off with the data being wrong from the beginning, you're going to come out with the wrong result at the end. Or just like your optics of the data are wrong. So this is what I was trying to sort of say, is like, I like Osteisen's book because it's useful in the simple fact that it helps us to actually look at this period and go, what are we looking at? What's actually going on? What have we missed? And I think many people misunderstood that, at least, or just saw the title and just went straight to the comment section because it seemed like that's what happened. Alongside this as well, mainly because of modern day politics, people are kicking back against using the terms Anglo-Saxon or stuff like that. A lot across in the United States, the term early English is starting to be used, which again is really complex because the idea of Englishness is very different to the idea of Anglo-Saxon. And so they're using early English to try and get away from Anglo-Saxon, and that's almost more problematic in many ways because it then brings up the question of what is English? And that can be a very difficult question for different people in the modern age too. So this is, a lot of stuff is being mixed in together. One of the things I'm quite clear about, and I like to say this, and hopefully you'll understand because of the background I've given, is that when we're looking at this period of the 5th century, so the 400s, the 500s, even into the 600s, there are no Anglo-Saxons yet. Now, before you run to the comment section, hear me out. The reason why there are no Anglo-Saxons is that there wasn't this identity in the area of what we now today call England of a group of people who would refer to themselves as Anglo-Saxon. These people instead would refer to themselves probably by their family unit, their tribe, or possibly even at, in the later stages in the 6th, possibly at the start, well, in the 600s, by their kingdom. So we start seeing kingdoms like Bernicia, Deira, Mercia, East Anglia starting to form, Kent. These kingdoms that we know, people might say, well, I'm Kentish, or I'm I'm Bernician or Dieran, or, I'm one of those. That might make more sense, but would they think of themselves as Anglo-Saxon? I'm not so sure. It's like someone might have had a wider understanding of who they were, but it's not exactly like that. So that's one of the things I think is really important to explain, is when people are saying there's no such thing as the Anglo-Saxons, what they're meaning is that at that period, that identity didn't exist. And that wasn't later until the dynasty of King Alfred that the identity of the Anglo-Saxon really started to form, in contrast to the Dane, as a way of uniting these people together to fighting against the Danish. So moving on to genetic studies, there are 3 early genetic studies. There's Wheel et al. In 2002, Capelli in 2003, and Leslie et al. In 2015. Now these are interesting studies because these studies are based on modern day genetic research. So what they did is they took genetics that they had labelled as Anglo-Saxon. They had decided these are the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic DNA that we can identify. So we're going to take a group of people and we're going to start looking at towns and cities in the British Isles or regions or things like that. And we're going to try and find out how much of the population are actually Anglo-Saxon. Some of this research came out with stuff like only 40% of the English are Anglo-Saxon or stuff like that. And every so often they pop up. Leslie et al. Was far more in-depth in 2015. They took a huge sample study of modern day British people and they started mapping out, and they could see where there were different differentiations in the British population and the genetics, and saw that in the south and the east of the British Isles there was a higher concentration of people who could possibly be considered Anglo-Saxon, and then there were different areas as well that had more unique genetics as well. So for instance, they found out that West Yorkshire had a different genetic signature to the rest of the other population. But what they did was they found people whose grandparents had lived in the same place as their grandparents, and therefore they said, well, this people, that probably means that they have been living there for a long, long time. Unfortunately, it doesn't allow for medieval migration, it doesn't allow for early modern migration, it causes its own trouble. So Leslie et al., fascinating piece of research, but it's got its own problems that come with it. So let's look at the aDNA now. So aDNA is ancient DNA. So what you do is you take human remains from the past and you analyze their DNA and you get results from that population. So you're not doing a sort of reverse engineering where you're taking a modern population, taking out certain genes and genetics and going, that there is the Anglo-Saxon DNA, and then applying that onto a modern population saying, well, this is the result. What you're doing is you're taking that population from their specific time in history and you're saying, right, this population here is this group and they have their genetics that we know are this amount Anglo-Saxon or this amount British or this amount this group, and so they take that and they give modern day names to genetics from that period and then they assign them that way. So Schiffels et al. Is one of the first ones that did an aDNA study, and they took 10 individuals from a small area around Cambridgeshire. When they took these 10 individuals, they had a range from the Iron Age, so before the Roman period, right the way through to the post-conquest period. And when they had those individuals, they then broke them down, but the majority were from what we would call the Anglo-Saxon period, so that's sort of 500 through 800 AD. And when they did that, they then started researching and doing studies, And then they came up with this headline that the English were only 38% Anglo-Saxon. Now this study has a lot of problems with it. One, because of tiny sample size. So you're looking at a small amount over quite, a geographic area around Cambridge. They used a couple of different sites. So one was, for instance, a male Anglo-Saxon burial on his own, whereas another place they had a small group of, I think it was of women, and then they had an Iron Age burial, and then all of this. But they said, all right, but it was within a very small geographic area of Cambridgeshire. Now, when you've got that small geographic area and very small sample size, it's very, very poor to suddenly go, this is the whole of England. This is the whole of the English Anglo-Saxon DNA, only 38%, because then you have all sorts of issues that come with that, and you're also analysing people who are not within this period. So the Iron Age population, these people who sometimes get called Celtic, and if you've been on the channel a while, you know that I don't like using Celtic, so it's called Iron Age Britons. They were being lumped in with this as well. So that's why this started off, and it started this sort of precedent that then went on from there. Roughly at the same time as Sheffield was doing their study, another study was done on the population of York. They were comparing the pre and post Roman occupation of York in the DNA, and they basically said, well, the pre-Roman population was, Yorkshire Iron Age. The Roman population was quite diverse because they had people who were from the Mediterranean and were from what is modern day Levant, so like talking about Syria, Jordan, that sort of area. And then you also had people who afterwards were from Central and Northern Europe, who were what we would traditionally call as Anglo-Saxon. So that's a very interesting one as well. And a useful one just to show that changeover, because York would have obviously had quite an interesting, as a legion capital, as the northern British capital during the Roman period, had quite a lot of people from all over the empire who were stationed there. Now, the main ancient DNA study in recent times that's really helped us with the early Middle Ages, and especially the Anglo-Saxon question, is Gertzinger et al. 2022. Now, they took 218 samples from across the British Isles of early medieval DNA, and they compared it to 182 continental European ones. And their basically conclusion was 76% of the early medieval, so they were looking at from about 400 to 1066, was from Central and Northern Europe. Now, the really interesting thing about this was it was over quite a long time. These people migrated over the course of 200 to 300 years into the British Isles, and as they migrated in, they mixed with the local people. This study actually helped to disprove the idea of a genocide. So we can see that people came in, they mixed with the locals, and then there are children with what's called an admixture. And an admixture means that they have genetics from both parents who are of different ethnic groupings. So we could see that there was someone who would be from Central and Northern Europe, mixing with someone who was from Britain, and then they had the children who had a mixture of both DNA, and the children were being treated in really interesting manners. And what we see is that within these burial grounds, they also analysed grave goods. And when they analysed these grave goods, what they found was that British women, so women who had DNA similar to the Iron Age British DNA, these individuals continued to be buried in the traditional manner and with grave goods that were associated with the British population for quite a period of time. So they continued to reflect maybe maybe a small c conservatism, and or at the same time they were the ones who continued to hold on to an identity that was maybe Romano-British or something like that. That's one possible conclusion, or it could just be that that package of grave goods was seen as what women would wear in that period. It's something that we can't draw conclusions straight and narrow about, and a lot more research needs to be done. But sometimes we saw men who were this Western British and Irish DNA, these people who would be similar to the Iron Age population, and they are buried with grave goods that we associate with the Anglo-Saxons. So they are being buried with shields and spears that we would call Anglo-Saxon. They are being buried with, swords that we would call Anglo-Saxon, with brooches that we would call Anglo-Saxon. And so there's almost like this transition over, which is really, really interesting, where these people are choosing to be buried, or their family members, when they die, are burying them in the style of this new group who's come in, this new group who have migrated into the British Isles. So it's again a real question of, when we're calling these package of items Anglo-Saxon and stuff like that, we have to be a little bit more careful, because the people being buried with them genetically might not be that, but they may have identified or seen themselves as Anglo-Saxon by the end of their lives, or their friends and family saw them to be buried with this package of goods, because that was what was expected of someone in this period. That was what a warrior was buried with, because that's the way it was. So it throws up a lot more questions than answers. Now, one of the things that I absolutely love is in the south and the east of the country, in what is today, like southern England or eastern England, they actually found out in some places up to 40% of the ancient DNA in those areas was the same as a package of DNA from Iron Age France. Now, the real question this throws up is, and this population wasn't present before in previous Roman populations. They checked with local cemeteries and stuff like that. So this came in during the migration period, during this post-Roman period. And so is this group people we would have once seen as the Franks coming in? Or is it a migration from northern France, or whatever it is? But this is enough of a population that 40% of the DNA in those areas could come from it. So in graves where they've seen items that have previously been called Frankish because they're the same as grave goods in northern France, is that this population who's migrated in? And that's a really interesting one as well. And another really fun one for the idea of English identity. Then when people are looking at it, your ancestors, you think, oh yeah, we're Anglo-Saxon, but what actually, if you're descended from the Iron Age French population who migrated in, but they are being buried in a very similar fashion to what we would understand as the Anglo-Saxons. So the DNA in itself, the ancient DNA, is just data. It's pure data that we're being given, that we have to analyze, to look at, but it almost creates more questions than answers in the long run, because we've got this new sort of population that we never even knew was there before, now in and amongst everything else. Alongside that, we've also got the fact that we've got people who would be considered Western British and Irish, the Romano-British, or the Iron Age, the people descended from the Iron Age population who are being buried with Anglo-Saxon goods. We see women who are traditionally continued to be buried in the manner that they had been before. All of these different things are factors of this period that make it a lot more complex than what you read in Gildas and Bede with, the Britons fleeing to the hills and, being pushed out by the Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons coming in and killing everyone. Instead, you see this much more of a mix where people are mixing together and all of that stuff. And it really throws up questions in that way of like, were the Anglo-Saxons actually conquering? Some of them would have been hired to come in and fight in this post-Roman period, but again, in the age we live in now, we're very aware of stuff like climate change. So were they actually climate migrants? Were they fleeing from where their homelands were flooded in southern Denmark, in northern Germany, and places like that? There's all of these questions that we need to do more excavations, archaeological excavations. We need to do more DNA studies. We need to do climate studies and find out what the climate was like in their homelands around this period of time, and then get a real understanding of what's going on. And then when we have all of this answers together, we can really get a sense of this amazing and vibrant period that is the early medieval period. And I hope I get, capture that passion I have for this period, because there are so many more questions and answers, and hopefully we'll get some more data that we can get a better understanding of the period. But I'm pretty certain that we'll never have a full answer of what's going on around this time. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed the video today, that you've learned something, that you've been able to really engage with this and go, wow, isn't that really interesting? I'll put some links in the description, and I hope that really creates more ability for you to go away, read more, have a look at the original data, and really get an idea of that. But I hope I've introduced it to you all the same. If you have enjoyed the video, please do go down into the description where you can see I've got a Patreon, and alongside that coffee account, and that really helps me with creating more content like this in the future. But in the meantime, I really hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and you join me for another video in the near future. Until then though, stay safe and well, and thank you very much.